9, 12, 10, 28, 2, 23.
This is Deep State Radio.
Hello and welcome to the podcast. As you know, each week about this time, we talk about some aspect of the campaign and politics. And because the media is such a big aspect of it, I thought it would be a good idea to have a conversation with a couple of experts who understand what's going on. So that's what we went out and found. And we've got two great ones here. Dan Froomkin is an American journalist and editor of Press Watch, who is known for his focus on accountability journalism. Welcome, Dan.
Hi, David. Nice to be here.
And Jeff Jarvis is an American journalist, media critic, professor emeritus, and co-host of the podcast This Week in Google. How are you doing, Jeff?
Thanks for having me, David.
So here we are in this campaign, and, you know, in every campaign, certainly for as long as I can remember, which is months, there's always, a subtext of, oh, the media is getting this wrong, and oh my God, the New York Times, and, those kind of things. And I certainly want to get to those. But one of the things that struck me and sort of led me to want to have this conversation is that I get this sense that something much bigger has happened, that there is a much bigger change afoot. That Kamala Harris can't ignore the pleas of the New York Times and the Washington Post and the networks, that she really needs to talk to them if she wants to be taken seriously. She can't do that unless they're less important than they used to be. And they don't seem to realize that the big story here is that for most Americans, most news and information and commentary comes from different channels than it used to. And that's for better or for worse, because some of those channels are easily polluted with disinformation. Some of them are superficial. Some of them are echo chambers. But my first question, let me start with you, Jeff. But my first question is, has the whole landscape of the media changed so much that, maybe the New York Times and the Washington Post and the networks are kind of the blockbuster videos of media?
I do like that. I think your theory is right at the start. Yes, the landscape has changed, but I think there's something deeper going on. I believe that the New York Times is broken. The Washington Post is broken. CNN is broken. And I don't think they're in the tank for Trump. I'm not canceling my subscriptions. I don't think that their mogul owners are dictating every headline. I think something deeper is happening. Jay Rosen wrote a piece in 2017 saying that when the financial support for the Times shifted from advertising majority to subscription majority, something was going to change in the newsroom. And I think what's interesting there is when A.G. Sulzberger talks about independence, I think he wants to prove his independence from his own readers by pissing them off every day. And I mean that literally. But I do think what's more than that is that we're seeing the death of mass media. And that is infrastructural, as you say, but I think it's more than just the fact that people get news from Twitter. I think it's panicking big old media. We don't need them. And the big, Dan is covering the story, but most media critics are not covering the story, which is that there is a huge sea change in liberal attitudes toward what's so-called mainstream media. The right wants to destroy media. The left wants to fix it. And the left is fed up with how badly the Times and the Post et al. Are doing in this election.
Well, what do you think of that, Dan? And by the way, parenthetically, both of you guys occasionally will tweet or write something that is an outcry against, some of this broken journalism. And I just want to say psychologically, I'm very grateful.
Thank you.
You're not alone. You're not alone.
I often get comments from readers saying, you're keeping me sane. And I consider that the highest praise in that they're not alone. I certainly agree with Jeff that the Times and the Post are broken. I think their political coverage has been horrible. I think it's been out of touch. I think it's been normalizing Trump in a way that is really seriously ill. I don't entirely agree that they're irrelevant. I also agree that it makes perfect sense for Kamala Harris not to subject herself to an interview from the New York Times or the Post, because they would just be asking a bunch of gotcha questions to try to trip her up, not to actually elicit information. What I don't agree on is that I still think the Washington Post and the New York Times have an enormous amount of impact on the political conversation in America. Maybe not so much directly anymore, although still directly, but through the cable TV, people who repeat what they say, who use the Times as an assignment editor, to the local newspapers that print the wire copy from the Post, the Times on their front pages, to the network news that basically is a rehash of what happened in the Post and the Times that morning. I think they're still hugely influential. And so neither Jeff nor I are willing to give up on them. And I think it's important to keep the pressure on.
Yeah, well, I mean, there's a Pew poll from a year or two ago that sort of said, that said, where do you get your news? And the vast majority of people got the vast majority of their news from social media or other sources like that. And the number of people who said they got their news from print media was 5%. The same number who said they got their news from radio. Now, do you remember that radio? But some of those people obviously are getting the New York Times in little bits and pieces via Twitter or TikTok or Instagram or something else. So they're morphing into different forms. But if Dan rejects the idea that they are irrelevant, which I hope I didn't say, I think we probably can agree, Jeff, that they are less relevant, and that a lot of that's on them. That they just didn't keep up with things, and it's gotten to the point I feel deep empathy for this guy who does New York Times pitch bot. Because how does, he's regularly these days going, no, sorry, can't equal this one.
Yeah.
That's just so out there. And I'm wondering if you feel the same empathy.
I feel gratitude to PitchBot because he shows that we're not alone. I wrote a post after Margaret Sullivan said that Kamala really should talk to big media. I wrote a post saying, but what media? No, not this media, not the Times, not the Post, not CNN. And I thought with that post and other posts I write that I would get attacked all around. No more. What I counted on that post. I got 6 defensive journalists going after me. But the rest is rabidly angry at the Times and Post. So it's not just about being relevant or irrelevant. It's about an irritation factor now. It's colitis in the political digestive system. And I don't know what they think that they're doing by the coverage is highly Trump focused. Yes, we all know the sins, both sidism. But what strikes me more than anything else, I wrote an open letter to the Post the other day, where I thought I saw the glimmers of self-reflection, and then it disappeared in a puff of smoke as they went back to the reflex of both sidism and so on. And the real problem is that they're not explaining the greater context here. They're ignoring the fascism at the door. Jay Rosen talks about this a lot. They're trying to make the asymmetrical symmetrical. They're trying to act as if both sides are sane. We know they are not, and they don't have systems or structures to deal with that. What they should be doing, what as a journalism instructor, I'm not really an academic, I'm only a journalism teacher. I think that we have made a mistake in only teaching our students the skills of the production of the commodity of content and not the context of history. One exception I see is Jamel Bowie, who, when he saw the dogs and cats in Springfield meme, said this is nothing but blood libel. I didn't see that explanation most anywhere else. And I think that that's where we fail the public badly, is by not bringing in the context of history and anthropology and sociology and ethics and philosophy to our journalism, because we're a bunch of schlubs who type.
Well, there I will disagree with you. Speak for yourself. Some of us aren't schlubs. No, and I also, I have to say, I think you're overstating it. It's not colitis. It's irritable bowel syndrome. But, some of these folks with whom I have the greatest issue, Dan, are not schlubs who type. I mean, they're schlubs. I mean, on a personal level.
There's also good people. We didn't give that caveat yet. There's still good journalists doing good work at all these publications. We should say that as well.
Yeah, no, there's some excellent journalists out there sexting with RFK Jr., but but a lot of these people who are sort of the frontline ones, they make a chunk of money from their newspaper, and it's not enough. So then they make a chunk of money from their book deal, and everything they do is to promote their book deal. And they don't report things in the newspaper because the book deal pays more. And then they make a chunk of money as commentators on various cable news networks. And they have to sort of maintain whatever that stance is. And they become little brands in and of themselves. And it sort of twists the role of journalist, which, I have to admit was probably a little better when they were schlubs with typewriters who were invisible, because then, they realized their job was to report the truth and not to get the book deal. Sorry for the rant, but what do you think there, Dan?
Well, I think your point about how they have to maintain their stance is exactly right. You don't go on a cable news show because you've been booked to say A and then say, I think about it and now I believe B. And I think that what has been needed all along is a recognition that the way we've been covering this election, it just doesn't work anymore. And but the fact is that for all the reasons that you maintained and others, these top-tiered journalists in our national media are incredibly defensive and utterly uninterested in even discussing the critique from folks like Jeff and you and me. Just the other day, Maggie Haberman gave an interview with NPR in which she basically says there was an industry of people on the left who wanted to, convince the Times to be pro Kamala. And this was so wrong in so many ways. First of all, there is no industry. I can assure you, being in charge of a tiny nonprofit that makes no money.
Well, look, secondly, that's what a nonprofit is supposed to do. I run a tiny for-profit company that makes no money.
And the other thing is that we're not asking them to be in the tank for Kamala. We're asking them to report the truth and to focus on the lies. As far as the lies go, it was so interesting. You look at the old, algorithms of political media, and it's A says A, X says A, Y says B, and you decide. And over time, they've started to become a little bit more accustomed to the fact that Trump is lying, but they still haven't grasped the fact that basically the fact that his entire campaign, his entire pitch is a lie, is the story. It's not like it's not a sidebar. It's not a fact check. The fact is that what he's saying is lying to people. What he's saying is what they're doing is preaching blood libel, and you can't get around that with the old algorithms of political news. But they won't change. They won't listen to critics. They won't address the critics. They won't even acknowledge what the critics are saying.
Yeah, Jeff, one of the things that people talk about a lot these days, and I think of it in the context of what Dan just said about lying, is the term du jour, sane washing, which I prefer the term auto tuning, because essentially what they do is, Trump says, 300 words that are incoherent, and they pick 7 of them and turn them into something that a politician would say, and then they report on that. He like talks all about windmills and cats and dogs and how attractive he is and stuff. and then the Times runs a headline: Trump takes strong pro-growth economy stand. And I'm like, what? What, and as for Dan's comment about lies, a lot of these places have a real sort of allergy to calling a lie.
And a fascist, and a racist, racist. I think it has been said that we in journalism think the problem is disinformation, and because we're in the information business, we are the solution. I have come to believe that information is not the problem, thus neither disinformation, that we have a crisis of belonging. And, I reread Hannah Arendt and see in the origins of totalitarianism and see a pattern that is described there that is right now very familiar, of people who are alienated from their communities out of fear and hate, and then become vulnerable to the siren call of the cultist, the authoritarian, the fascist. And I don't know what a journalism that deals with that crisis looks like, that deals with a lack of pluralism in society, the people's lack of connections in society. So yes, the lies matter, but I think that we make the mistake as journalists and also in pollsters, and don't get me started on the evil of polls, in thinking that people believe what they say. It's not about belief. It's about signaling. To say crazy shit is a loyalty test for Trump. If you're willing to say that and Vance, that Haitians in Springfield eat cats and dogs, you don't have to believe it. You need to say it so that you can be part of that club, because you're a part of nothing else. That's a much
But how big is that
deeper
club?
Well, it's 30-40% of the country, it would appear, not
Right.
such at extremes. But what do we do about that? That's what I fall apart on.
Well, I don't know that you can do anything about that. I think you need to focus on the 50 to 60% who are still reachable by reality. And that's why I do think fighting against disinformation is so crucial. I think the mainstream media dramatically underestimates the power that Fox News and News Nation and the right-wing, ecosphere has in terms of injecting falsehoods into the mainstream. If I were, the editor of the New York Times or the Washington Post, I'd be running stories every day about things that Fox said that aren't true, because I think it's just imperative that we counter this disinformation rather than, let it keep flowing.
Well, let me plug one of my alums, Juliet Jeske, started something called Decoding Fox News. She watches Fox News so we don't have to. I used to be on MSNBC air when I was still there. I haven't been on in a long time. And I would urge them to do that, just as you did the New York Times. And they won't do it.
Yep.
They won't criticize media.
Right.
So I gave a grant when I was still at CUNY to Juliet, and she's doing this brave, and I mean brave, work every day of seeing not only what lies do they tell, but what don't they tell? What are they ignoring to that part of the country?
Yeah,
that's brilliant.
No, I've seen it, and it's good. And I do think, frankly, one way to fight disinformation is effective media criticism. And it needs to be more mainstream. And by the way, it manifests itself in a lot of ways. I've always thought, it would be good to sort of do a show where you sort of read the newspaper with people to explain to them, like, oh, you see that this top quote here is unattributed, and then the bottom quote in the article is a kind of flattering reference to a senior official. That's who gave the top quote. Or did you know that reporter X goes salmon fishing with this official every summer? Because it would just be helpful to people to have a little bit of context, I'll give you an example of this, and I don't want to pick it. I mean, I could give you literally 1,000 because I live in Washington, and these, my friends are these people, and a lot of them are good people. But I'll just give you one example. I think Nicole Wallace is great. I am a super fan of Nicole Wallace. I think she tells the truth. She's courageous. Her show is a good show. I've enjoyed being on her show. But periodically, she's on the show with the guys she lives with. Right? I mean, I don't know. Are they married? Yeah. Or I don't know. Maybe they're married. They have a kid now. Yeah. But she never mentions it. And I'm like, come on. Shouldn't that be so? When Peter Baker and Susan Glasser are on the same thing and they're married to each other, doesn't that matter?
Well, it's fascinating because Peter Baker actually still sticks to this very normalizing line about Trump, whereas his wife does not. So I think that's fascinating.
Well, and it could be a division of labor in the family. It's one thing when you're writing at the New Yorker to take this sort of one tack, and it's another when you're writing at the New York Times.
I don't know how relevant that is, actually. But I look at this morning and yesterday morning, Al Sharpton was on the air and barely discusses how he gave New York Eric Adams. And we pushed and pushed and pushed for Eric Adams, their own history.
Yeah.
Joe Scarborough can drive me nuts on given days. But I also, and I wish we heard more of the history, not of the grand Reagan days, but of the mistakes people make, the things that he backed that he wishes he wouldn't have.
Well, did you see that show today?
Yes.
Did you see his little tribute to the Contract for America?
Yeah, that was a little much. And I also saw Buehler calling Trump an entertainer. That he's entertaining.
This is Elizabeth Buehler, the
Washington chief of the New York Times.
Washington bureau.
But on the other hand,
it's an incredibly influential job.
I'm almost ready to do a post. Be more like Joe. And I can't believe I'm saying this, and Dan's about to stick his tongue out at me. But he will call fascism fascism. Nicole Wallace will call fascism fascism.
Yeah.
They will call out what this is in a way that the New York Times and the Washington Post are scared to do.
But
they haven't suffered terribly professionally for it. They're not being marginalized as weirdos by
Well, and I think that courage is to be commended.
Yes,
and I admire those people. I'm not saying that. I'm just saying there are these kind of strange little things that happen. But I'll give you something that's not so strange, but is a bigger example of this. For the past year and a half, every single day of my life, I would go into a breakfast or a lunch or a meeting or a cocktail party in which somebody would say to me, Joe Biden is not up to the job. Yeah. They would say he was losing it. They would say he was just getting old fast, and so forth. And nobody wrote the story. Now, I think one of the reasons they didn't write the story is because they thought, some of them, well, if we write that story, then Trump's going to be the next president, and that'll be a disaster. Not that that's necessarily a judgment they're supposed to make, but I think that influenced it. But there are big, big stories like Trump's mental decay right now that just don't get written.
There was an excellent column in the San Francisco Chronicle about a week ago by Ed Wasserman, the former dean of the journalism school at University of California, Berkeley, and he wrote that the failure to report on Biden's decline was, if Trump now wins because Kamala Harris hasn't had enough time to fully campaign, will go down as one of the biggest journalism failures in history, after WMD. And I thought that was a really interesting point. I don't entirely agree. And I know Jeff probably will disagree very violently. But I mean, Mike, what you had was this snarky drip instead of real coverage of the issue. And so I was, along with Jeff, was horrified at the sort of nasty, sort of snide approach that the New York Times and others took to covering Biden's old age issues. I thought they're giving a megaphone to this nasty little aside by the special counsel was ridiculous. But at the same time, I think that there was, in fact, an issue going on there, that he was losing his edge. And that should have been a major story. And it should have been a major story earlier.
I'm not violent, but I will disagree. I think that the New York Times and certain people there especially took glee in kicking him to the curb. They acted as if this was a big story, and they still have not covered the insanity of Donald Trump fully. They still have not gone into his psychosis. And so it's the reverse both sidism. They went after Biden. They did it publicly. They did it cruelly, and they haven't done the same to Trump. And they still look at their coverage today. It's Trump centric, right? They covered her economic. We must have policy. We must have policy. Okay, here's policy. Well, let's compare it to Trump and let's downplay it. I did a post the other day, just a tweet where I looked how far down the page, how many 6 screen loads before you got to her major policy announcements on the economy. And what do they say when he blathers something stupid? It's up at the top of the page. In
the last 5 days of the Washington Post, they've been 4 Trump stories on the front page and not a single front page story about Kamala Harris.
Right. So it's also what they're not covering, and I think I'm more concerned about what they're not covering about Kamala Harris. And also they're going out to the classic pitchbot diner stories, and they're not capturing the vibe, I hate using the word, of the joy that in fact exists now among everyone that I can see around this election, something that's unprecedented in my lifetime, with the exception of
it's interesting because they can have a dampening effect on that, but Dan, it goes to another issue, and that is kind of herd mentality, right? So let me say something that'll sound like just a straight question, but is actually me patting myself on the back. But for the
aren't they all?
Who
do you think you are, Joe Scarborough?
As many of them as possible. But I for the past 3.5 years, have written a lot of articles saying Kamala Harris is doing a great job. Mm-hmm. And I was, for the past 3.5 years, one of very few people writing articles saying she's doing a great job. And she deserves more credit. She deserves more space. She can be a bigger asset for the administration. And I would go to these parties and people would say, this idiot over here, he believes this thing. But, I would provide evidence and they would ignore it. Because the prevailing winds were she's, not a great manager, or she's not up to the job, or, she can't handle the spotlight. All of which, then July 21st happens. And literally, 4 hours after she's the candidate, she starts hitting them out of the park every 5 minutes. And it's like, wow, who knew she could do this? And then, I'm like raving my head. I did. But anybody who saw her did. They weren't covering the story.
The herd mentality is exactly right. And I'd say that it actually it's manifesting itself now in the conviction that this is a close race that will go down to the wire and will be decided by a few thousand votes. It's possible that's true. But in my latest column, I actually write that I think the press is basically stubbornly sticking to this narrative that it's a squeaker, despite the considerable evidence that Kamala is running away with it. So, I mean, maybe I'm dreaming, but to what Jeff was saying, there's a sense of joy, there's a sense of enthusiasm among Democrats haven't seen before, at least since Obama. Republicans are endorsing her. The economy is going great. Stock market's at all-time highs. So I'm wondering whether the herd mentality isn't still operating, and especially among pollsters who basically can put their fingers on the data these days and make they want.
And do. So, you look at the polls, Jeff, and 30% of the polls, I'm making these numbers up, but so do they, so don't worry about it. But 30% of the polls are bought and paid for, Republican polls, Democrat polls. You can't believe any of those. And another chunk of the polls are about registered voters, which completely doesn't mean anything because those polls are always wrong because not all of them show up. Another bunch of the polls are just done by cell phone, and anybody who's under the age of 90 who gets an unsolicited cell phone call doesn't answer it because would you? And then, you get to the so-called credible polls, and if you look in the fine print at their sample, they'll say R+5, R+3. And that means that they think that Republicans should be oversampled because they will overshow up. Now, as it happened in 2016, they did. And that's why Trump eked out a victory. But as it happened in 2020, 2022, and all the interim elections that have happened since Roe v. Wade, they oversampled Republicans. And, if you look at the polls where she's up 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 points in battleground states, and then you look to the bottom and it's R plus something, it could mean that she's actually up 6, 7, 8, 9, 10% in those if it follows the recent pattern. Now, that didn't take me that long to say. You could present it that way, but of course, certain people on TV who are put in the business of presenting these polls don't do it. And they don't say, by the way, it's even more important to look at early voting numbers. It's even more important to look at registration numbers. It's more important to look at donation and volunteering numbers than the polls, which all, by the way, support your thesis, Dan. So I think you can feel a little more relaxed, feel confident. But what about this, Jeff? I mean, it's kind of a black hole in these campaigns.
Well, first, I'm superstitious, and I have PTSD from 2016, and I need you both right now, after that fit of optimism, to turn behind to that well-worn, wonderful walnut wood behind you and knock wood, damn it. Don't jinx us out of this. Now,
yeah, well, there's a certain Jewish tradition that we will also both avoid, which is spitting on the floor, which is
So, in answer to your question, this is when I always raise the spirit of the late James Carey, a Columbia professor, who said that opinion polls are the ruin of democracy, for they preempt the public discourse they intend to measure. And this is the outcropping of mass media, and the idea that we can put people into buckets, and mass idea is that it's a way to ignore people, to not listen to them, not understand what they have to say, not understand their identity. So the polls are all bullshit. They are not just that, not just whether they're right or wrong. They are damaging to the election because they have an impact on the election, and they reveal much more about the pollsters than about the citizenry. So I'm on a constant rant against polling as an industry, and it is an industry that makes money.
You say you're not violent, but you seem to be on a lot of rants.
Bloggers,
Well,
is he wrong? Is he
wrong? No, he's absolutely not wrong. But I think that's a big part of it. We've got 5 weeks to go, Dan. What should they be reporting that they're not reporting?
Oh, well, there's so much. I mean, to start with, they should be reporting on Trump's mental state. And there's been a little bit of that. There was actually a Post story, a Washington Post story that they're saying Donald Trump's imaginary and frightening world, which actually sort of got to that a little bit. So that was a sign of optimism. But they should be writing about how he's losing it on stage. He's completely demented. They should be also, I know this is quaint, but they should be writing about the issues. They should be, and so I not long ago had a column.
You crazy kid,
yeah, exactly. 3-point plan. I had a 3-point plan the other day in a column I wrote. One is to identify key issues, explain what's at stake, discuss solutions, and then explain what each candidates are proposing. Whoa, crazy idea.
Pollyanna.
And then the other thing is the other two have to do with these lies. If I were a newspaper editor, I would say, how is it that people are so confused about these things? I would actually take a poll to determine what are the most highly trafficked common falsehoods. And I would make it my mission to write article after article in which I explain how that's not correct. And I explain what is correct. And I would not just debunk the lie, but I would explain its origin. I would explain what it's there, why it's there, what it's doing, who's spreading it, whose benefit it is. So there's a lot the press could do instead of what they're doing now, which is basically, covering up for Trump's inability to speak rationally, mansplaining everything Kamala Harris does, not confronting misinformation accurately. I could go on and on.
Well, look. I have a lot of respect for Dan here, Jeff, but let's just you and me talk a second because no. I mean, I think because what he said there, yeah, what he said there makes a lot of sense to the degree to which this were a normal election. But I would argue, as a potential counter argument offered in the most constructive possible spirit, that Donald Trump is a criminal, a rapist, a racist, who led an insurrection, who is beholden to a foreign enemy of ours that is funding his campaign, who failed as president, ranked dead last by historians, has never told the truth, 33,000 lies during his last presidency, and none of his policies actually matter because A, they make no sense, B, he doesn't understand them, and C, he doesn't mean any of them because he's not really a president. He's a guy who's running for an office to stay out of jail. And that if we report this is Trump's policy position, there's an embedded lie in that, which is that he has a fucking policy position and that the real story is he wants to blow up America and make our enemies stronger and undermine our alliances and deport 20 million Americans, which will produce a fucking civil war in this country, and at the same time be in charge of the internal body parts of lots of women and the external body parts of gay people and so on. So, is the story really policy?
The story is race. And we are three white guys sitting here talking about this. But I came too late in life to fully understand how that is true. And my theory is that I wrote a book called The Gutenberg Parenthesis. There, I got a plug in which I go back to looking at the origins of what we now think of as media. And what happened was that voices who did not have a place in public discourse at all suddenly did, and it caused, a 30 years war and a reformation and all kinds of other things. And my theory is that Black Lives Matter is the Martin Luther and the Reformation of our time, and that there are voices that have always been there that were not represented in so-called, and I always put air quotes around it, mainstream media, because it's not mainstream at all, run by people who look like the three of us, old white men. Dan, your hair is getting gray, so I'm throwing you in here.
Yeah, fair enough.
And that it's old white male, uneducated America that resents this and would sooner burn the fields than share the crops with those who follow. This story is essentially about race. I'm not qualified to cover that. The people who were at the New York Times and other media are not qualified to cover that clearly, though there are voices inside. It's fascinating to me, I don't want to get them in trouble, but to look at how Nicole Hannah-Jones and Jamel Bowie subtweet journalism, let's say, in what they say about how things are covered. And I think that's really important. And if we could let them loose on this, we would learn a great deal. I'll agree with Dan only to this slight extent. They should still cover Kamala Harris's policies because she has them and they're ignoring them. Look at the last 4 days. She let out huge economic policy. Yesterday with Zelensky, she showed herself to be a foreign affairs expert. Today, she's going to be down at the border dealing with that mishigas. And we still need to have better coverage of her. But David, you are right. See, I'm a peacemaker in the end.
That's beautiful.
The real story of Trump is his insanity and the perils around him. But what that enables, call on Arendt again, is a better understanding of what's happening in the society around race and how that's being exploited by Trump and Vance now with no holds barred. Blood libel out there for all to see. And that's a huge story as well. And then, I'm sorry, one more.
What both of you said.
We also need to look at media as the story. And media, of course, won't do that. So we have to stay on their ass.
To pick up on what both of you said, the guy is everything David said he is, but he's still going to get a large number of people voting for him for the reasons that Jeff outlined. And I think that's missing from the mainstream media coverage. I don't want more diner interviews, but I do want to understand the dynamics of these Trump voters. What percent of them are motivated by what?
They're not going to tell you, Dan. You have to.
They're not going to tell you, but you could. But a smart interviewer can talk to these people, and they can figure out what's motivating these people, and I think they can do sort of sociological studies of these folks, because we don't understand why it's even close if it is close.
So I agree, but hire the sociologist who's qualified to do that.
Okay.
Not the idiots who are running focus groups on MSNBC. I won't name any names.
Or the New York Times, yeah.
New York Times.
This has been very cathartic, and I feel much better. And
I feel worse.
I do too. Yeah.
Well, that's just because he called out your gray hair. But I look, and it's just something we learn to live with, or in my case, repress, because my theory of life is repress until you die. If you can repress things until you die, nothing matters. But in any event, I've really enjoyed this conversation, and I think we should have it again. And I think we should add a couple more diverse voices in this group, because I'm as tired of old white men as anybody. So maybe in a couple weeks, we'll invite you back with a couple more voices and continue this conversation, because it's the right one to have. And frankly, other than following you guys on social media, I just don't see it in as many places as we need to see it.
Amen.
Well, do come to presswatchers.org, and drop a dime in the cup. So.
Presswatchers.org. Okay, you've both gotten your plugs in there, and I support that.
Capitalism.
I support it. And while you're at it, if you're not a member of the GSR network, anyway, thank you everybody for listening. Thank you, Dan. Thank you, Jeff.
Thank you.
And we'll be back with more a few times a day, every single day.
Thanks,
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.